Story 1. The Trail Marker. I'm 28 now, but this happened back when I was 22, during a solo backpacking trip through the Olympic National Forest in Washington. It was late September, the kind of crisp, clear weather that makes you feel alive, but also reminds you winter isn't far off. I'd been planning this particular loop for months, a challenging 40-mile trek over 3 days, deep into some of the less traveled sections of the park. My gear was dialed in, a lightweight tent, a reliable water filter, and enough dehydrated meals to last me a week if I got stuck. I even had a cheap plastic compass clipped to my pack, mostly for show, as I relied heavily on my GPS and the well-marked trails. The first day was uneventful, just the steady rhythm of boots on dirt, the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I made good time, covering about 15 miles before finding a secluded spot near a small creek to set up camp. The night was cold, but my sleeping bag was rated for it, and I drifted off to the sound of the creek gurgling and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was the second day, however, when things started to feel off. I woke early, packed up, and hit the trail by 7 a.m. The path was narrower here, less maintained, and the forest felt denser, the trees taller and closer together. Around mid-morning, I came across something unusual. It was a trail marker, a small, weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree, but it wasn't one of the official park markers. Those were always green with white lettering, clearly indicating trail names or distances. This one was just a rough, unpainted piece of wood, maybe 8 inches long, with a single, crudely carved arrow pointing directly off the established trail into the thick undergrowth. There was no text, no symbol, just that arrow. It felt out of place, almost anachronistic. I paused, checked my GPS. The main trail continued straight ahead. I shrugged it off, figuring it was an old hunter's marker or some local's shortcut, and kept going. About an hour later, I saw another one. Same rough wood, same crude arrow, pointing into the woods, away from the path. This time, it was a little unsettling. 2 random, unofficial markers, both pointing into the wilderness. I checked my GPS again, just to be sure I wasn't missing a turn. Nope, still on the main trail. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the exertion of the hike. It was the kind of shiver you get when you realize something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on why. The third marker appeared shortly after lunch. This one was different. It wasn't nailed to a tree. It was stuck upright in the ground, right in the middle of the trail, forcing me to step around it. And the arrow, it wasn't pointing into the woods this time. It was pointing directly behind me, back the way I had come. My heart started to pound. This wasn't random.
Who? And why? The isolation of the deep woods, which had felt so peaceful just hours before, now felt oppressive, suffocating. I picked up my pace, a knot forming in my stomach. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of bird song and rustling leaves replaced by an unnerving silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the trees. The idea that someone was following me, or worse, waiting for me, was a chilling thought. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a prank, maybe some strange local tradition, but the crude, almost menacing nature of the markers, especially the last one, made it impossible to dismiss. I hiked for another 2 hours, pushing myself harder than I normally would, my eyes scanning the tree line, my ears straining for any sound other than my own breathing. I didn't see any more markers, but the feeling of being watched, of being directed, never left me. When I finally reached my planned campsite for the night, a small clearing by a lake, I didn't waste any time. I set up my tent quickly, built a small fire, and spent the rest of the evening huddled close to it, listening to the sounds of the forest, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden observer. I didn't sleep well that night. The image of that backward-pointing arrow burned into my mind.
The next morning, I packed up before dawn and practically ran the remaining miles out of the forest, not stopping until I reached the trailhead parking lot. I never went back to that part of the Olympic National Forest, and I still can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was trying to tell me to leave, and that I was lucky I listened. Story 2. The Cabin in the Clearing. This story isn't mine, but it was told to me by an old park ranger named Frank, who'd spent nearly 30 years patrolling the remote sections of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was a quiet man, not given to exaggeration, which made his account all the more chilling. He told me this happened in the late 90s, before GPS was common, when rangers still relied heavily on maps, compasses, and their own intuition. Frank was on a routine, multi-day patrol, checking on remote campsites and ensuring trails were clear. He was about 2 days into the backcountry, deep in an area known for its dense rhododendron thickets and steep, unforgiving terrain. The weather had been clear, but a sudden, unforecasted storm rolled in, bringing with it a torrential downpour and a thick, soupy fog that reduced visibility to mere feet. He knew he couldn't continue safely, so he started looking for a place to hunker down. That's when he stumbled upon it, a small, dilapidated cabin in a clearing he'd never seen before. It wasn't on any of his maps, and Frank knew the window. No chimney, no porch, just a simple wooden door. It looked abandoned, ancient, almost swallowed by the encroaching forest. Despite the eerie feeling it gave him, the storm was worsening, and shelter was shelter. He approached cautiously, hand on his sidearm, and pushed the door open. The inside was even more unsettling. It was completely empty, save for a single rickety wooden chair in the center of the dirt floor. No fireplace, no furniture, no signs of recent habitation. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood. Frank stood there for a moment, the rain drumming on the roof, the wind howling outside, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. It wasn't just the cabin's age or its unexpected presence. It was the feeling that it wasn't empty at all, but rather waiting. He decided against staying inside. The feeling was too strong, too wrong. He backed out slowly, pulling the door shut, and found a small overhang of rock nearby, just enough to keep him dry from the worst of the rain. He spent a miserable night there, huddled under his poncho, listening to the storm rage, his eyes constantly drawn to the dark silhouette of the cabin through the swirling fog. He couldn't shake the image of that single chair, sitting there in the middle of nothing, like an invitation to something terrible. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the fog began to lift. Frank packed up his gear, his mind still on the cabin. He decided to investigate it more thoroughly in the daylight, to report its existence and, perhaps, even to mark it for demolition. But when he walked back to the clearing, the cabin was gone, vanished. There was no trace of it. No broken logs, no disturbed earth, no sign that anything had ever stood there. The clearing was just a clearing, surrounded by the same dense forest. He walked the perimeter, checked his compass, even tried to retrace his steps from the previous evening, but there was nothing. It was as if the cabin had been a phantom, a temporary manifestation of the storm. Frank never told anyone else about it, not officially. He knew what they'd say. He spent the rest of his career in those mountains, and he never saw that cabin again. But he told me, with a look in his eyes that I won't forget, that sometimes, when he was deep in the woods and a storm was brewing, he'd feel a cold spot, a sudden drop in temperature, and he'd know, instinctively, that he was near the place where the cabin had been, or where it might appear again. He said some things in the woods aren't meant to be found, and some places are best left undisturbed. Story 3. The Whispering Pines. This happened to my cousin Mark about 5 years ago, when he was working as a seasonal fire lookout in a remote tower in Montana. It was his dream job: solitude, nature, and a chance to offering panoramic views of miles of dense, untouched forest. He had a radio for communication, a small generator for power, and a few weeks' worth of supplies. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive, mostly on unpaved logging roads. The first few weeks were idyllic. Long days spent scanning the horizon for smoke, evenings reading by the light of a propane lantern, and nights filled with the silence of the wilderness, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. But as the season wore on and the days grew shorter, a subtle change began to occur. It started with the wind. Mark had always found the sound of the wind through the pine trees to be soothing, a constant natural hum. But one evening, as a particularly strong gust swept through the ridge, he noticed something different. It wasn't just the sound of wind, it was whispers. Faint, indistinct, like a crowd murmuring just beyond the range of hearing. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the isolation, the tricks his mind was playing on him. He'd been alone for over a month after all. But the whispers grew more frequent, and sometimes clearer. He'd be making coffee in the morning, and he'd hear what sounded like his name, carried on the breeze. He'd be scanning the horizon, and he'd hear what sounded like fragments of conversation, just out of reach. He tried to record it on his phone, but the recordings only picked up the sound of the wind. It was always there, just at the edge of perception, a constant, unsettling presence. One night, a severe thunderstorm rolled in. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the tower, and lightning illuminated the forest in blinding flashes. Mark was huddled inside, trying to ride out the storm, when the whispers intensified. They weren't indistinct murmurs anymore. They were clear, distinct voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but with a tone that was undeniably menacing. It sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking at once, swirling around the tower, pressing in on him. He could hear individual words, though he couldn't comprehend them, and the sheer volume of the sound was terrifying. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it was angry. He grabbed his radio, desperate to call for help, but the static was overwhelming. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the tower into darkness. He was alone, in the pitch black, surrounded by the cacophony of whispering voices and the raging storm. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, covering his ears, trying to block out the sound, convinced that whatever was out there was trying to get in. He saw shadows moving outside the windows, indistinct shapes in the flashes of lightning, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was not alone. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the whispers had faded, replaced by the familiar, soothing sound of the wind. But Mark was a changed man. He packed his bags, left a note for the relief ranger, and hiked out of the forest that very morning, not even waiting for his replacement. He never went back to that tower, and he never took another job that required him to be alone in the deep woods. He still hears the wind, he told me, but now every gust carries with it the faint echo of those terrifying whispers, a constant reminder of what he encountered in the whispering pines.